Gamze Turki, who's joining us from the University of Antwerp, the law faculty. She's a postdoctoral fellow there and a member of the Law and Development Research Group. So Gamze is also a member of the IEL Collective, and so that focuses on international economic law, and of the NEFDEF network, which is focusing on new frontiers of development finance. So Gamze is also the author of a recent monograph with Cambridge University Press on children's rights and business, which was published in 2020, so just a few months ago. And formerly she was a Fulbright Fellow at Yale University. So Gamze has kindly agreed to join us today to launch the seminar by discussing and helping us shaping a more kind of broader picture of the financial instruments that are underpinning the European Green Deal. So what she will do with us, she will talk about multi-stakeholder partnerships and how they have an impact on human rights in terms of accountability. So the title of her presentation is Stakeholder Partnerships and Human Rights Accountability, What Implications for a Greener Future. So we couldn't think of anybody better than Gamze to actually help us trace this bigger picture and also try and understand the accountability of private non-state actors in the context of climate change and transition to a greener future. So without much ado, I think I'll leave it to Gamze, and then we will open the floor for questions later on. Thank you, Gamze.
Thank you so much, Daria, and it's wonderful to be here. It's a pleasure. Thank you so much to Daria for inviting me for this, I guess, very first webinar of your exciting project. And so I am going to already start. I'll try to share my screen so you can see the name of my talk, and I'm really looking forward to seeing the outputs and the outcomes of this exciting project on the European Green Deal. It's so timely, but also so important to look at what will come out in terms of specifics in terms of a just transition and how that is going to be both delivered but also financed. And so I will, there we are, sort of give you a roadmap, pretty short roadmap that will come back. First, we will look at the background to the multi-stakeholder partnerships on the development agenda, but very briefly, and then look at multi-stakeholder partnerships and multi-stakeholder initiatives more broadly as they're at the front line of what is being called innovative financing for development that tries to draw in the private sector more and more intensely. Then we will touch upon human rights concerns and accountability issues that are linked to the existing schemes. I will walk you through what is happening on the environmental front from a very specifically multi-stakeholder partnership perspective. So of course there's a lot going on, but I'm just going to give you a couple examples of involvement by multi-stakeholder partnerships in the design and rollout of new or refurbished development financing schemes. And then finally, I want to talk about the European Green Deal and the SDGs and how they converge and how the proposals to finance them actually take us back to the discussions on all those innovative schemes that were rolled out, presented through multi-stakeholder partnerships. And finally, to sort of give you my 2 cents on what implications I think there are of those discussions for a greener future. So here, let's start with the background. And so I will, yes, this didn't work so well, but let's start with the first part. And this is a basic sort of, history of multi-stakeholder partnerships. They first started with UN voluntary funds for communicable diseases in developing countries like river blindness and malaria, which is still on the agenda of the Global Fund, which is one of the biggest multi-stakeholder partnerships. This was really a focus on cooperating with the pharmaceutical industry to give treatment in terms of donations to those programs that were rolled out by the UN and through the help of the World Health Organization. In the 1990s, with Agenda 21, the major groups, the so-called major groups, were given stakeholder status in the effective implementation of social and environmental goals. And of course, these stakeholders, these major groups included farmers, workers, women, indigenous populations, but also the private sector. And you see with the Global Compact in the new millennium, that private sector engagement is trying to be crystallized, is also put in a global governance, sort of good governance, good business scheme that is voluntary, completely voluntary, tries to put a sort of positive spin on business involvement and development. And the MDGs, they have a specific goal on the Global Partnership for Development, which is now again taken up with the SDGs, SDG number 17, that's on the Global Partnership for Development. And at the time of the Millennium Development Goals, the multi-stakeholder partnerships are proposed in two areas. One is pharmaceutical, with the pharmaceutical industry. So that's taking us back to the idea of communicable diseases. And of course, you have to remember that the HIV/AIDS pandemic was at its worst at the latter half of 1990. So going into the new millennium, we're thinking about cooperating with the pharmaceutical industry for equitable access to medicines, including antiretroviral drugs. And with the rollout of the World Wide Web, we're talking about cooperation with the private sector to give developing countries and the people there access in information communication technologies. And when we come to 2015, so I've tried to sort of highlight those two targets under SDG 17, where there's, of course, a continued accent on a global partnership, but also multi-stakeholder partnerships, not just to mobilize knowledge, expertise, and technology, but also to mobilize financial resources. And again, and sort of another accent on partnering with the private sector, but also the civil society in resourcing and developing resourcing strategies. And these have included innovative financing schemes that we'll sort of cover in a few moments. And here, just to give you an example, sort of a broad brush picture of what kinds of partnerships, multi-stakeholder partnerships that are out there. Of course, it's not just in the area of development, it's really in the area of any area that is governed transnationally in terms of policy making and implementation. So you have the Internet Governance Forum, the climate partnerships for the Global South, you have the Global Environment Facility that we'll look at later in this talk, but you also have partnerships in areas that are what I call people-related aspects of sustainable development. So nutrition, food, healthcare, the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, Tuberculosis and Malaria, Gavi, the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunization, and the Global Partnership for Education, which started out in the World Bank as a program, but has since become more independent, although, you know, the independence issue is questionable still because the Secretariat is at the World Bank, but it's become an entity of its own. And let's sort of look at how, as the SDGs promise, how these partnerships will generate more financing, but also how they will generate different financing strategies. And this is an older sort of diagram that is that was put in a report in 2014, just as these innovative financing schemes were being sort of increasingly proposed and used, because there was really an urgency starting with 2010 to meet the Millennium Development Goals, because there was such a shortfall. People realized we need more financing, we need to pile on these initiatives. And the ones that I've highlighted on the screen. So the bonds, the advanced market commitments, development impact bonds, debt swaps and buy downs, and donations, they were majorly rolled out through multi-stakeholder partnerships. And what was innovative, and this is of course a report that promotes these, so just keep in mind that, but it was either a new product, a new market, or a new participant, so a new investor in that market, existing market. And it either tried to raise funds, so mobilize resources, tried to put in new financial intermediations, which if you think from a financial investment promotion perspective, you're putting more players in the market, so you're making money from money, which also goes into the pockets of those that are intermediating, meaning the banks that you use or other types of financial actors that you use to channel the money from wealthy countries into developing countries. And finally, you might be delivering development in projects in more substantive terms. So you see that these the AMCs that we will look at, they were trying to build a new product and a new market. And they were relying heavily on financial intermediaries. Development impact bonds, it's a new product, and it tries to deliver a project. Debt swaps, it's a new product. Existing debt markets are already out there, but they're trying to mobilize resources that will go into development in a different way. So here, multi-stakeholder partnerships have played really, really crucial roles, and I'll sort of give you 3 examples, and I think they're the reason why I walk through those is 2 of them are very topical because of COVID. And another one is topical because they're trying to also replicate similar initiatives in conservation biodiversity that we will touch upon later. Advanced market commitment. So this has been a hallmark of the Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, for pneumococcal diseases. So these types of diseases are causing high morbidity and mortality in developing countries, but not so much in wealthy countries. For that reason, the pharmaceutical industry doesn't really have an incentive and a big market in wealthy countries to first research into these and secondly to develop these and marketize these. So as a sort of remedy, what was proposed is, okay, let's make a new type of instrument, a financial instrument, where we get donors that give subsidies to the pharmaceutical industry to start researching and developing these vaccines. And in turn, so we have these legally binding agreements between the entity to which donors are giving the money, so in this case, Gavi, and vaccine manufacturers that are actually sort of competitive. They're not competitively bidding, but they're going through a vetting process. They're signing up to be a part of this scheme, and they will receive subsidies to develop vaccines. Once these go through the usual safeguards and efficacy checks, they are going to be put on the market, but the manufacturer pledges to give the multi-stakeholder partnerships, Gavi, a number of doses, a volume of doses at a given price, at a low price, that will go into developing countries, low-income countries. And you see here that this is actually being done right now for COVID. And this is called the COVAX facility. And this is the schematic you see here is the preliminary technical design. So it's been, I think, modified a little bit, but I wasn't able to find a final version. So this is, the whole idea is really that you have donors, but you also have self-financing countries that sort of commit to these legal agreements. Firstly, these are all private legal agreements between firstly the donors and the Gavi, and then Gavi and also UNICEF that will distribute, for instance, for the pneumococcal vaccines, the vaccines to developing countries, but also between the manufacturers and Gavi and the World Bank, which is a trustee. So they are very complicated, multi-layered agreements. But the idea is, if there's enough support from the donors And these can be donor countries. So this can be official development assistance through wealthy countries of the OECD Development Assistance Committee and others. But also that these can be foundations, philanthropic foundations, corporate foundations, personal foundations. And once we have these sort of this investment up front, then we can subsidize the production of such vaccines, and we can actually offer them at a lower price than the market value at the end. So this is an idea, and it mentions additional instruments to finance vaccines, which is, as we are sort of going back to vaccine bonds. So this is the second instrument. And this has been around. It's being also set up for COVAX, for COVID vaccines that are being developed or that are at different stages, because different parts of the world, different pharmaceutical companies are developing COVID vaccines. Some are at an early trial stage. We know that Moderna and Pfizer have, a sort of an efficacy approved from the preliminary findings, sort of vaccines already. This has been sort of set up as a front-loading mechanism, which means that the donors would pay upfront. And here you have a nice sort of, I like visuals because those help me understand it better. But the donors are long-term donors. So this can be a 10 to 25-year immunization program. But the donors you see on the bottom here, number one, so step one is that they have multi-year pledges. They can do it for 5, 10, 15, 20 years. And they give sort of a chunk of, a big chunk, a sizable portion of this money up front into the International Finance Facility for Immunization. That entity releases bonds on capital markets. Those are bought by investors here. So the money that comes back is given by Gavi, through Gavi, the multi-stakeholder partnership, into it's pooled with other resources of Gavi. It can be given as direct funding for immunization, so it's a donation, it's a grant for immunization program, or advanced market commitments that we've just spoken about. And finally, the idea is that you deliver vaccine programs, and at the end of a maturity period, the investors would get their money back with interest, but the donor governments would keep making sort of annual payments that would cover those returns. So the idea is that the investor takes on a bit of risk by buying a long-term bond that has a long-term maturity, but that they get paid with interest. And this is being rolled out for COVAX, but it hasn't really sort of garnered the interest that one would have hoped, or that at least the multi-stakeholder partnerships would have hoped. It's at an early stage, but it's sort of rolled out with the advanced market commitments to really be able to subsidize the production of vaccines up front, because there are obvious concerns that wealthy countries would have their pick first because of their financial resources at their disposal, and the lower income countries wouldn't have the resources to access that kind of dosage, volume of dosage from pharmaceutical industry, because it's going to be in demand and there's not going to be any problem selling this product. So from a purely market perspective. And then moving on to from the health sector, where the multi-stakeholder partnerships are big and they're very powerful and long-standing, to multi-stakeholder initiatives. They're not as formalized, but this is a new type, well, not a new type of instrument, but the repurposing of social impact bonds to go into development. And social impact bonds, they're not new as much as one would like to think. They were rolled out in wealthy countries first, actually, in the UK, partly in Canada and the US. on small scale sort of local projects to fund, for instance, early childhood education where there was no public provision. And the idea is that you get investors, you get a service provider that provides education. In this case, this is Educate Girls initiative that was rolled out in India. And you make an agreement. And there's going to be an outcome here. There's an institution or a donor, a foundation that guarantees the returns from the investment. So the foundation says, okay, you want to invest in girls' education, great. I will, you will, put out bonds, the investors will buy those, and I guarantee to pay the returns, the interest on those bonds when the project terminates. And of course, this is always results-based financing. So in the beginning, you agree on what the targets are. And if the targets, the outcomes, the social, educational, healthcare, conservation outcomes are met, then the investors are entitled to a return that will be guaranteed by, in this case, the Outcome Pair Children's Investment Fund Foundation. And there is an evaluator, an independent, supposedly independent evaluator that is going to look back at the project and to make sure you've hit your targets before investors can be paid. And investors can range from different types of actors. Even the proponents, of course, question whether these are scalable. So these tend to be smaller interventions in terms of the size. And here, this was conducted in Rajasthan. So, it was conducted in a province in India. And of course, the issue of sustainability, of what happens after 4 years. These tend to be shorter term. What happens after 4 years, 5 years, 3 years, and the project ends, but there are, of course, still a stream of children who are growing up and who still need education. So it's not just you take 2,000 girls and you educate them and you're done. There's a constant stream of demand. And critics also raise concerns about diverting financial resources from existing public mechanisms of education to short-term interventions and what that does, and if there is an opportunity cost to rolling out these separate initiatives in a way that are investment focused. And of course, there's also a question mark as to what the financial risk is. Because many times the proposition is that it's a risky investment, the state doesn't want to take it on. It's not clear how risky investing in girls' education really is. And that brings me to that third component of what happens to human rights. And this is especially pertinent in the case of global public goods that are also human rights. In our world, we would see human rights governed legally by international human rights law, or at the domestic level by constitutional law, fundamental rights. And the content of those rights are either defined in the treaties, interpreted by treaty bodies, case law from international courts, at the international level, at the domestic level, in legislation, in specific legislation or jurisprudence. And when you talk about education as a human right, or healthcare as a human right, food as a human right, and you design a development intervention, at least many funders of these interventions will pay lip service to human rights-based approaches, which contain non-discrimination, transparency, and participation of local populations, and respect for the content of rights. That is not the case, at least explicitly, for all of these different instruments that are out there in trying to finance innovatively. And I focused in my postdoctoral research on education. So here, this is a snapshot. If you think of education as a right, there are rights holders. There are individual children or adults that will benefit from this right, that have this right, or collectivities like indigenous peoples that have a right to be educated in their culture, language. They're duty bearers. So there's a corresponding duty by a state And sometimes non-state entities and international organizations, there are different types of duties that need to be undertaken, respecting the right to education, protecting it, fulfilling it. And the content that is set out in the Convention on the Rights of the Child and in the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights looks at education, at least primary education, as a public good that is ought to be accessible to everyone, non-discriminatory, and free of cost. Secondary school, of course, needs to be affordable again, and depends on the, of course, national jurisdiction, but many national jurisdictions also have that provision of free public access to secondary education. There are minimum core obligations that need to be fulfilled, and retrogressive measures, at least in the case of children's rights to education, are considered impermissible. When you think of education or any other right that is also global public good as an interest scheme, a stake, you will have sort of interested parties, the stakeholders, the ones that have an interest, a stake, that are trying to devise a joint interest collaboration. And sometimes they have different goals. Sometimes they have to bargain, to negotiate, to agree on the common. And one of the concerns is that it sometimes ends up being the lowest common denominator approach. It's the standard, but it's the minimum standard that everyone can agree on. And then the rest isn't set in stone, so to speak. And you compare that to rights and obligations where, as a person or as a collective, you have those rights, and when those rights are not respected or protected or fulfilled, there's an addressee of those rights. There's a duty bearer. And if the duty bearer breaches those obligations that it has, it gives rise to some form of responsibility. That can be liability, but that can also be other types of remediation. And when you bring in all these power considerations at the global level, to how the rights to education, food, healthcare are politicized, are still in power dynamics, in legal power dynamics that do not always equitably treat different people in different jurisdictions, you have a lot of issues, even for law that is in the books, issues of accountability. For multi-stakeholder partnership approaches, of course, there's nothing written in law that governs these. It can be internal documents, it can be policy decisions, guidelines, but it's hard to seek responsibility for breaches of obligations related to your rights, and accountability really suffers. And I will come to this at the end when I give my sort of reflections of what implications we have for a greener future in Europe. So I'm looking now at multi-stakeholder partnership approaches in an environment before moving on to our discussion question. And very similarly to what we've seen in healthcare and education, we also have multi-stakeholder partnerships in environment. And of course, the Global Environment Facility is one of the largest, but it's hardly the only one. In this specific model, the Global Environment Facility is replenished periodically. So there's a pledging conference, replenishment conference, and the donors that are state donors, but also philanthropic donors and corporate foundations, other types of foundations, can pledge to contribute to the 5-year budget of this institution. And the institution receives those pledges in grants, in donations, in different chunks, usually not upfront, all of it together, but then it finances projects, and increasingly it is being solicited to finance projects that are innovative financing schemes. So one interesting, very recent example is the Rhino Impact Bonds. And this wonderful, majestic animal is unfortunately endangered. These are black rhinos. And this project was the project proposal was approved by the GEF in 2019, if I'm not mistaken. The idea is it's very much the same as the development impact bonds for education. The idea is that you set targets from the beginning, you get an outcome payer. In this case, it's the Global Environment Facility that pledges to pay for the returns to the investors if the targets are met. You issue bonds. So these are going to be the Rhino Bonds, and they implement a project. So this is a 5-year conservation project that will focus on repopulating a part of the park where rhinos lived, and now they're endangered. There's going to be an evaluation, and then if the evaluation is successful in terms of the targets being met, the outcome payers, so the GEF, will pay the investors the returns on those bonds. And this is much like education. It's a short-term project. I guess more differently than education or healthcare, because it's conservation, it's really sort of geared towards increasing the numbers of actual rhinos present there. It might have, if it's successful, it might have an impact on the population of rhinos increasing, but of course, beyond the term of that project, it's not going to address the root causes of why the black rhinos became endangered in the first place. That being said, it might work to increase the numbers of these beautiful animals where they were supposed to be anyhow. But again, it's a very much short-term project focused by the funding. And against the backdrop of beautiful Seychelles, another sort of innovative investment scheme that is actually not so innovative because it originated in the 1980s through conservation NGOs, is being revived now through debt to health schemes by the Global Fund, the big multi-stakeholder partnership in health, the Global Fund, in a different way. And this is sort of the revival of debt for nature swaps. I think it's very topical because we're also hearing about debt for climate deals that are being proposed, and it's really important because we have another sovereign debt crisis at our hands, and of course the investors want to still not lose their capital, and there's going to be, and the civil society and many people who are concerned are calling for at least a moratorium, if not a complete cancellation. And this is a different way to go about it than the donors canceling the debt. The role of the multi-stakeholder partnerships here was that it was reported that the Global Environment Facility and the UNDP were involved in the planning phases in 2012. So this was rolled out in 2018. And this is a more convoluted scheme in a way. So if you follow the steps, here the impact investors, so the so-called impact investors and the donors that give the grant, they give a loan, so from the impact investors, and a grant into a trust, the Seychelles Conservation and Climate Adaptation Trust. That trust gives a loan to the government of Seychelles. The government of Seychelles takes that loan to buy its debts from the Paris Club creditors, 93.5 cents on the dollar. So it uses $20.2 million of the loan it gets from the trust to buy 21.6 million of debt. So there's a discount of 6.5%, which is, it's not even $1.5 million dollars of discount. So the creditors are getting, a good value for money than they would if the government had to default, for instance, on its debt. And in return, the money, so the cancellation of the debt that happens is backed by 2 notes of different maturities 10 years and 20 years, 3% return. And the investors in those notes buy those notes, and it goes to the adaptation trust that then is used to repay, well, some of the money is used to repay the loans to the impact investors, and some of it is put in projects of marine conservation and climate adaptation, and there's an endowment that is going to be built so that you can keep making money from the money you have available in the trust. So these are, again, being rolled out now more and more through a multi-stakeholder approach, as opposed to back in the day when heavily discounted debt would be purchased by conservation agents. And now let's look at what is being proposed for the European Green Deal. In light of all of the things we've seen in terms of the different instruments. There's a great deal of convergence between the European Green Deal and I think the SDGs, and some of these these SDGs speak also to the areas of priority or action of the Green Deal: biodiversity, sustainable agriculture, farm to fork, clean energy, sustainable industry, of course, urbanization, eliminating pollution, climate action, more sustainable mobility. And how is this going to be financed? So I think here it gets interesting. And of course, the bulk of the money will come from the EU budget. That is granted. But the European Commission, so this is the European Commission's own graph. The European Commission has proposed an Invest EU scheme. And this is the idea is that you will have these guarantees that will be rolled out through intermediaries, the European Investment Bank Group, but national promotional banks and international financial institutions to catalyze or mobilize private sector investment. And so this is that part of private and public, right? So it's going to use, and here it says it will be triggered by the EU budget, right? And what will be triggered by the EU budget is 279 billion, and in total it will be at least 1 trillion. So the idea of the Invest EU guarantee is to crowd in, as the terminology goes, the jargon goes, the private sector investors into higher risk projects. And this is going to be, I think, the crux of the questions around the just transition from a development financing perspective or a green financing perspective, because it's the same template that is going to be proposed. And of course, the instruments, they remain to be seen. The specific instruments that will be used remain to be seen. But I think there's an important sort of focal point on innovative financing and crowding in private investors through guarantees that will be given by the European Union itself, through the Commission that will fund the European Investment Bank Group and national banks and international financial institutions. And finally, what implications for a greener future? So having covered all of that, all of the issues there, what implications? And I think there are some accountability lessons that we can take from multi-stakeholder approaches to financing sustainable development. And this is from a paper that will be published, my paper that will be published soon. But looking at these different financing schemes from an accountability perspective, not just a human rights accountability perspective, but a development cooperation, aid, assistance, and human rights accountability perspective, I see that there's really a lot of responsibility that's diffused. So the norms that are supposed to be respected in development assistance or human rights are not always within the system respected. And the responsibility, so the norms that are going to govern this area are very much diffused. There's an increasing promotion of financialized instruments, the ones that I spoke about, linked to multi-stakeholder partnerships, and stability of these partnerships is not guaranteed. It's very limited because there's not a clarity about whether and how much duty they bear towards beneficiaries, although they should be responsible when they engage in public services or public goods. More and more, there's private interest and corporate models that are legitimized. If you look at results-based investments, right? The idea is that you go for easily measurable indicators and targets. So the interventions you are proposing have to be easily measurable. The number of rhinos, the number of black rhinos you have at the end versus the population you started out with. And finally, the enforceability. There's really weak enforceability. These, at the system level, there's really no system level prevention of abuses, and there's no remedy to failures to respect development cooperation commitments or human rights obligations beyond very limited ones that are linked to the state, but then there's really not a direct link between the beneficiaries and the states, the donor states that channel their money through multi-stakeholder partnerships. And one interesting development is that these multi-stakeholder partnerships, bigger ones like the Global Fund and Gavi, have been negotiating immunity agreements, both in their places of incorporation, so with the Swiss government in both cases, but also for the Global Fund in places where they are hosted. So where they have offices in many African countries, they've sort of negotiated privileges and immunity agreements. I think in light of all these accountability lessons from the multi-stakeholder partnership scenery, we have to keep in mind when we're talking about discussing the European Green Deal and a greener future that it might bring, that partnering with the private sector often requires private legal agreements that are governed often outside of public international law or domestic law. Many, if you look at them, for instance, the vaccine bonds through IFM, they contain arbitration clauses, or they might. From an effectiveness perspective, you might end up with undelivered or partially delivered promises and non-sustainable short-term initiatives, which is a real risk, which I will call one-hit wonders. And there's a risk of commodification and marketization of nature and global public goods, and a danger, again, of diverting public resources away from regular budgets into these smaller size initiatives that are not sometimes scalable and not clearly sustainable. And my final word is that if we're going to construct a green future, we really have to look at prioritizing the needs of rights holders, whether they are human, non-human animals, or nature. And with that, I conclude. Thank you for listening. If you have any questions or comments, very much welcome at my email address. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen so you get a sense of everyone else. There we go. Daria, I think you're muted, possibly.
Sorry, I was too engrossed in your presentation. No, thanks very much for a fantastic presentation. I could listen to you for a very long time. So I have lots of questions myself, but I shouldn't abuse my chair position, and maybe I'll just give the opportunity to our participants first, and if not, then I can start with some questions I have. Please, you can send a message in the chat, or you can raise your hands, or you can wave. Okay, so I see Anastasia Kotova has raised her hand. Please, Anastasia.
Yes, thank you very much. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for an incredible presentation. I have missed the first minutes, but I think I've managed to recover most of the points. And my question relates to the normalization of corporate models and on, in a way, the obsession with the targets. And my impression is that this obsession permeates SDGs to the same extent, and that in a way we have already seen a major normalization of corporate model, because this is what SDGs embody, or at least that is my impression, that we have the same idea of measuring the progress and focusing our attention more on measuring the progress than on devising the strategies to actually achieve that progress. So there is more preoccupation with how do we understand that we move forward, or that there is something positive happening, than there is on how do we actually change something. So I was wondering if you had any ideas or thoughts on that, and thank you once again.
Daria, shall we take some questions, or how do we do it?
I think you can answer. We have plenty of time.
Okay.
So go ahead.
Okay, excellent. Anastasia, thank you so much for the question. And so I agree that there has been a normalization, right? There has been, and that when you think about it, it's a little bit hilarious, the number of targets the SDGs have, over 170, and the kinds of targets, not the targets, but the indicators, and that are attached to each target. You have a lot of targets, but you have very many indicators. And of course, there's I think, debate to be had about whether those indicators are the right way to measure progress, even from a very corporate target perspective of is that the right indicator to measure the number of initiatives you have, multi-stakeholder initiatives you have, and some that have some sort of governance framework isn't probably a good measure of whether there's enough partnering that's happening to engender change. And I think it's really a debate in global healthcare. The Gates model that a lot of authors that work on global healthcare governance sort of mention, it's really that you go for something you can show. And I think there is a big sort of risk of indicator fetishism. And I think the late Sally Engelmary had also sort of pointed to this, right? That it becomes, in a way, the measurements and the way that you measure becomes more important than, I think that's what Anastasia was getting at, the thing you're trying to achieve. And there's, of course, another risk of technification, of making all of these so complex that the beneficiaries, the rights holders, don't have a say or don't know how to have a say. Because, when you look at all these schemes that I showed you, if you don't dive into them deeply, and if you already don't have some finance knowledge, you're not going to be clear as to what is being changed and how, and how these things interplay with what you have as a right. As a girl child, you want to go to school, you want to learn, and you're put into one of these schemes and you don't know how the scheme works, or and so I think the technification is also another risk that comes with the focus on measuring, that makes it illegible to many people. From just a beneficiary perspective, and even I think for, and I'll speak for myself, but I assume Daria would agree, we've been working on new frontiers in development finance for a while now, and many of us work on different parts of it, right? And when we come together, it's basically the questions, Daria, tell me, like, draw it on the board, tell me how this works. And even for people who are conducting research on very adjacent fields, we have to walk through ourselves to see the intricacies and how you measure it, how you link it. So I think there's a real, so I think it has happened, you're right, that this sort of focus has taken over. And of course, as we near 2030, you know, or 20, now we're 2020, in 5 years, you know, people will start measuring and they'll say, oh, there's a shortfall. And we have only, you know, achieved 60% or 62% of what we set out to do. And that's probably the wrong way to go about, especially in these issues that necessitate structural change. But of course, we have structural change requires long-term planning and investments. And I think in political science, people talk about it all the time about, you know, governments having a 5-year or 4-year mandate and elections coming up, and, you know, people wanting to get elected and not wanting to do something for, you know, that will last for 20 years, in the fears that they will not be reelected because of actually undertaking that kind of big project. And I think for investments, there's a risk when you tie investments to, so when you take public money, the ODA money that you have available from donor governments, and then you promise investors a return so that you think that's going to attract sort of 10 times more money than you've put in, without really knowing whether that's the case or not. It sort of propels you to try to also game the system. Also to look for those indicators that are going to make your project successful. I think there's that kind of risk, more practical risk, when you're designing these instruments, that it's a sort of, there's a bias in choosing the kinds of indicators you want to choose, because you, of course, don't want to say, well, I've spent this much money and it didn't have an impact. So I think that it has happened, and there are a lot of risks attached to it. But I don't see a solution out of it unless, you know, the beneficiaries, the people, particularly people in wealthier countries that have a democratic say in how their tax money is spent, if it's going to development assistance, should hold the governments accountable for these types of projects that they support, for the types of schemes that they enable. And a conversation should be had in that regard, of course, also in developing countries themselves, about the kinds of deals that are facilitated. But I think there is a power imbalance that's out there that we can't deny. That the donors, you know, the one who pays, sort of holds the price, you know, the one who has the money will voice a pipe. I don't remember the saying, but if you hold that money, you have the leverage. And so I think many of these developing countries, they really need that kind of financing. So they will agree to any type of investment scheme, the innovative financial scheme that is being proposed, because, you know, educating 2,000 girls is better than not having that funding from a sort of recipient's country perspective. It's good to have a program than not to have it at all from that kind of perspective. But I think the question is, what is the best use of that money? And that is a question of leverage. To be able to shape that agenda is a question of leverage. And I think that is also linked to indicators and how things are measured, and why they're measured the way that they're measured. That's a convoluted answer to your direct question.
Yeah, no, thanks very much, Anastasia, for the question, and Gamze for giving us a lot of food for thought. I mean, in relation to our project, for sure, we see a lot of the fragmentation that you're describing, you know, the legal fragmentation that then leads to fragmentation in responsibility or dilution, and certainly the fragmentation of how funding is used and how aid and public money is used, whether it's funding from the EU that is channeled also to gas, for instance, natural gas, which is not really green. And so the fact that of course there is a lot of interest there at play that materializes in ways that are not necessarily leading to a greener to a greener future. And so a lot of complexities there that you have helped us mapping. So I will open the floor to other questions if anybody wants to ask anything. Maybe in the meantime, I'll ask you a question, Gamze. I'll use my prerogative. In your presentation, you talked about project implementers at different stages when you gave example. And I was wondering, in your research, how much have you seen NGOs in the context, perhaps not necessarily only of conservation, I was thinking, but also other green projects? And the education project that you were mentioning made me think of that, whether NGOs are also part of it, humanitarians, and what do you think are the implications for humanitarians in this sense? I mean, there are of course very clear humanitarian principles, or in the context of the green transition, there are very clear climate justice principles. Do you think these are affected somehow, or have you looked at some conflicts that might emerge in this participation?
Yes, indeed. So I think NGOs, and it's a difficult question. So from a legal perspective, if you look at how these multi-stakeholder partnerships are incorporated, they're almost always incorporated as foundations or non-governmental organizations, although they have a different structure. But the implementation stage hinges on NGOs. So in any type of intervention that I've looked at, many of these multi-stakeholder platforms, initiatives, or funders themselves, they don't go into the field to implement the project. They will fund it, they will guarantee the returns from it, but the implementation will hinge on a non-governmental organization that is on the ground, that is, again, a partner, a stakeholder in this project. And indeed, of course, it's interesting because you see sort of the project implementation, those people that are involved in that NGO and the implementation, that they pretty much make up a part of this type of thinking. So they're very much involved in the whole scheme of the whole planning as well. Even, I mean, development impact bonds, I've seen a few cases where it was an NGO, it was first an NGO that was established that went out to seek that kind of funding, saying, well, can we do something with impact bonds that will finance our project? And, you know, if it's successful, we can replicate it. But in terms of running pilots, sometimes it's the NGOs that actually bring the demand. Of course, whether those NGOs, when they bring up the demand, are representing the people on the ground is a different question, I think. Because I think when you think of it from a stakeholding approach, of course, the NGOs as entities or their management might have different interests than the people they intend to serve. And so I think that's a very good question, and I think it's something that we need to keep in mind. But I think that's also part of the accountability deficit in a way. That these are also non-state entities, that they have, it's a fungible sort of interaction that they have with the beneficiaries. They're not really legally, politically sort of responsible for delivering the results. Sometimes they look like they're do-gooders, and it's fine. But of course, systemically, when you think about the different the different number of different NGOs involved in these schemes, it's not negligible. So I think and they don't always, so they're not always going to espouse a principles approach. It's not a given that they will take into account climate justice principles or human rights principles or humanitarian principles. That's not a given. And oftentimes I think and this is just a hunch that I have, but it gives a level of legitimacy if you have a corporate, you know, a non-profit entity versus a for-profit entity doing this. They will say, well, it's not to finance ourselves, it's really to do something good on the ground. But sometimes that's the preferred way of setting up a corporate interest. So sometimes there is a corporation or a small business that wants to get into these issues, education, healthcare, what have you, that will set up a foundation, an NGO, and it employs people. I mean, at least it pays for people's salaries, and nonprofit doesn't mean no one makes money from it. It just means that they're not going to be trying to make more and more profit like a corporation. So I think the motivations might differ. I think some of them might be very genuine, but I think there's a sort of risk of instrumentalization of that legal structure to lend more legitimacy to the involvement of an entity in this kind of scheme, because it's, NGOs, we tend to think they're equal to civil society, but I have a sense that sometimes that is not the case. So I think we have to be really, really careful in appraising their role, because it might be a role that's different than the beneficiaries or the people there. So I'm not sure they represent as much the rights holders on the ground as their own sort of stake in this. And maybe it's a very laudable idea and a good ideal, but it's a different interaction, I think, than the one you have with the people on the ground.
Thanks very much, Gamze. So I see Radu has his hand up. So our colleague Radu Marish from the Raoul Wallenberg Institute. Please, Radu.
Thank you, Daria, and thank you, Gamze, for this wonderful presentation. So informative, super interesting. To your slide regarding accountability towards the end, there is a statistic that puzzles me regarding the SDGs and their database on public-private partnership, 5,000 partnership by 2020. And when you look at the reporting rate, the vast majority of these partnerships are not reporting to the UN. Over 3,000 are 2 years behind, close to 1,000, 1 year behind. I wanted to ask you, what do you make of these numbers? And is this actually evidence that the partnerships are not delivering, or what should we make of these numbers? Thank you.
Thank you, Radu. It's wonderful to hear you, first of all. And it's a wonderful question. And I actually have, sort of an answer that also is empirically informed. So I have been working on partnerships on education, and there's going to be a working paper coming out on this, hopefully soon. But I set out to document all the partnerships in education that were included in this database on education, so SDG 4 only. And there was, I think, about 1,600, a little bit more. And I wanted to see how many of them were actually multi-stakeholder. So I excluded one-time initiatives like a donation from a corporation of some books or some computers. That kind of thing. I said, okay, that's just a donation, but it's there as a partnership. So it's a partnership between, let's say, a computer seller in a developing country to a school. 3 computers, that's it. But it's there as a partnership or a voluntary commitment. So then I mean, it took a long time to first take this database and to put it into an Excel sheet, and then to sift through also partnerships that were bilateral, not that were just public-private or civil society public, and to really look at multi-stakeholder ones. And the numbers, now I don't have them, I have a ballpark figure. I think out of 1,600 some partnerships that I put into the Excel sheet, only 56 or 58 of them were multi-stakeholder, and not one time. So at least over time, a few years. And when I sent out a survey to these people, only 16 of those replied. And I wanted to see what kind of legal structures they had, et cetera. So because of COVID, I couldn't travel, which means I haven't been able to do the interviews yet. But it sort of gives you an idea of, and it's not necessarily that they had reported or not, but really that whether they actually were partnerships. So my first question before the interviews was, are they really one-off, this kind of donation schemes? or, because you can kind of, if you wanted to go, you can register Lund University. Say that I've given a course today on this topic, and that this was a partnership between the University of Antwerp and the University of, Lund University, and possibly if we had some NGO representatives here. So that would be, and if we had some corporate representatives, we might be a multi-stakeholder partnership right here. At least we could be recorded as such. So I think, yes, it's a hyper-inflated figure, and it doesn't mean anything, to be blunt. It really doesn't. And you have to do the forensic work of really, clicking on their website if they have one, reading through different languages, or using Google Translate to see if you can contact someone. But when you do that kind of forensic work, it doesn't look very good at the end in terms of the results you have. So I think it's a very inflated database. That's basically a voluntary registration of anything you're doing. So I don't think it means much. I think it was an interesting effort because I think that, again, in terms of measurability and indicators, the indicator, if sort of we can go back to it, is that, from the SDG 17 on multi-stakeholder 17.16, the targets, the indicators were, and I'm going to try to read this, the number of countries reporting progress in multi-stakeholder development effectiveness monitoring frameworks that support the achievement of sustainable development goals. The other goal about resources was amount of US dollars committed to public, private, and civil society partnerships. It means, in a sense, that the SMART, so this is the framework that the UN DESA devised. So it's these SMART measures and indicators. SMART as in, I don't remember this, but measurable, sort of time sensitive, et cetera, and this acronym was used to see, and there's a sort of traffic light scheme. If you're late on your reporting, you're a little late, you're yellow, and if you're really late, you're in the red zone, and if you've reported, you're in the green. And I think it was an effort to sort of show that the indicator was being measured in a way. But as you mentioned, Radu, I think if you now look at it, the first 2 years, there was a bit of more green here and there, but it's mostly that people stopped, people that register it, they put it in their newsletter as having registered on the Partnerships for Development database and put it on their website for a while, but nothing really structural comes out of it. It's a very good looking website, very sort of attractive, but does it mean that we're seeing change on the ground is questionable, and whether you want to present sort of any collaboration as falling under the SDGs. I think there's a temptation. I think it's increasingly done by governments, but also by the private sector. Especially, I see it in being based in Antwerp, but living in Brussels, I see a lot of these when the European taxonomy for sustainable finance was being discussed. There was sort of a compulsion to put a sustainability spin on any kind of corporate social responsibility project that was being done. And corporate social responsibility does not human rights obligations or sort of business and human rights make. It's really, if you were sort of financing a green, a stand at the Brussels Green Week or whatever, that was your sustainability initiative. So I think it's a lot of it's that these schemes that are again fungible, that can be fit into these boxes, these SDGs, because they're nice and they're colorful, and it's also a good marketing opportunity to say you're doing something in sustainability, because the young people, the ones that are going to be purchasing your materials or your goods, the ones that are going to be putting money in your banks, want to see this happen. They were on the streets until the pandemic struck, every Friday, you know, and those people are going to be your consumers, your the people you will have to answer to. So it looks nice, it looks good to be doing something on this, but of course the content matters, and it's not visible from those database types of sort of, you know, output.
Thank you, Gamze. Indeed, so the content matters, and there's, so as you talk, I'm thinking of a lot of issues. So what about when things go wrong? But before we go to that point, we have another question from Esther van Zimmeren, who raised her hand. Please, Esther.
Hello, Gamze, and hello, colleagues from Lund and from other places. I was just informed that you gave this lecture, so I arrived a little bit late, and I will also need to leave in a few minutes, but I couldn't help or couldn't prevent me from asking you a question, because I share your criticism and skepticism also of many of these mechanisms, the indicators for the Sustainable Development Goals. But personally, I don't know really how to do better. So, I want to actually also be hopeful and be a believer that indeed, even with corporate social responsibility, we can make a change, or that with these innovative funding mechanisms, we can make a change, because it does involve an awful lot of stakeholders that may otherwise not be involved at all. And those investors will be investing in other things. So if they then invest in biodiversity or some of the other purposes that you're mentioning, you know, maybe I rather have that they invest there than in other purposes. But on the other hand, of course, there's all those negative aspects that you also emphasize. So I was wondering, apart from your skepticism, do you have also some recommendations, or maybe first my question is, do you also want to be hopeful like me, or is your skepticism so strong that you say, oh, you know, just get rid of all of it, or do you also see possibilities to make improvements and to actually use all the initiatives that are there and to work with that? So thank you. And sorry if I'm leaving in a few minutes, but yeah, I have a few other things.
No worries, it's lovely having you.
Thank you, Esther. No, I'll try to be brief so that you hear my response before leaving. But so yeah, these are the concerns that I have, I think, accumulated over years of being involved in those discussions about what qualifies as innovative and what qualifies as development financing. And I'm not one to say we shouldn't have investments in it, or we shouldn't have private sector investments. So I'm not one that says, you know, nationalize everything. That's not, and it might seem that I have a lot of sort of strong criticisms, but I do think, and the criticism is more on the lack of governance and on the harmonization of sort of those rights we have and the constitutional rights we have as human beings, but also as nature, you know, we have to sort of preserve nature, and animals have to thrive in their own environment. But it's more a lack of sort of frameworks that can be applied, or in terms of the ones that exist, that there is not much that exists. So I think the idea is to have better oversight, to have better accountability to beneficiaries and rights holders. And it's not to say we shouldn't, you know, pay the pharmaceutical industry subsidies up front so that they develop a vaccine that's needed so much, but there is no market for it in the developed world, because, you know, and these profit-making entities, of course, they want to sell their product. That's fine. I think I would like to see more public oversight, especially when public money is being used to subsidize investors. I think that's one of the concerns that I have. And I agree that, you know, corporate social responsibility and investment in real sort of sustainable sectors are, and if you do corporate social responsibility right, it doesn't mean that you're doing your human rights you're undertaking your human rights obligations completely, but it can be positive. Of course, you can do a lot with the money you invest in those kinds of voluntary schemes. What I would like to see is a more honest discussion about how we govern it that really benefits the people and the animals, the non-human animals and the nature, in terms of what qualifies as sustainable, because we had this debate in the EU framework where hydropower projects, sometimes large hydropower projects are considered to be carbon offsetting. Of course they do, they offset carbon by a lot, but that's carbon that wouldn't, compared to coal plants, yes, but we know they're not sustainable. We know they are detrimental on the environment in other ways. So I think we really have to have a hard look at what kinds of projects we're supporting at what cost to the taxpayer in donor countries, but also to those people that benefit from it. So I think it's less the investment or the fact of investing itself, more the way that it's done right now. That is my concern. So I think that there could be intergovernmental ways of, and it doesn't have to be hard law, but to set some basic standards about sustainability of such initiatives, development impact bonds. From the two that were rolled out in India, there seem to be successful in terms of learning outcomes. But of course, we have to have an honest conversation about whether that money would still, through bonds, would be better used just going directly into the government of Rajasthan's education budget than going into this project itself. So I think those are and we have to have these conversations in an interdisciplinary way. I think development economists have to be around the table, geographers have to be around the table, lawyers and lawyers that represent both the finance sector, but also the communities. I think we have to have those conversations and devise ways of governance that mitigate the risks for those that should be benefiting from it, not just the investor. So I think that's sort of a balancing of powers would be what I'm after. So that's where my concerns lie, but it's not the fact of having an investment per se or a private sector involvement that makes it bad. It's, I think, the way that's being done unchecked to a large extent, that is my concern.
Thank you for your answer, Gamze. Can I gather, bye Esther, can I gather other questions? Yeah, Jessica is waving. Yes, please.
No, I just wanted to step in because I've been listening to you and it's been extremely interesting. Adam, I enjoyed it a lot. I just became a colleague of Daria and Britta in Lund, so I'm also a newcomer to this kind of research, no? So I'm like an outsider in all of this, and I see a very sort of developed language and way of thinking, and it's very tight, and it has all the components, and it's technically difficult, and somewhere, somehow, so we are like, so the strategy from an outsider to me is that we're trying really hard in this field to design a language and a strategy, an argumentative strategy, to convince the investors that they should invest. So donors, but not really donors. You won't lose anything. So that's really, I mean, you're a cold donor, but you don't, maybe I'm wrong, yeah? But you call donor, but you actually don't lose any money. Actually, you gain some money. It's not a high risk investment. I mean, it's like, okay, you have a perfectly designed language to make them look, I mean, you adjust it so that there's good reputation in there, no? So that's another sort of very strong argument. But I would run to invest. I mean, So you have the reputation, it's good marketing strategy. There is no accountability if things go wrong. And actually, I mean, in this setup, and still it seemed to me that there was not so many investors. So that's really worrisome. I mean, we have really like given up everything, and still there are not so many investors. So where, I mean, what is happening here? You know, like that's, to me as an outsider, or I might be completely wrong. In terms, if you're going to follow this sort of mindset, since we also gave them no requirement for what they have to invest in, I mean, like anything that looks good and they can register, etc. We should at least try to shape up and improve the language as to the quality. Like, I think you could sharpen it a little bit. I think that you can only you can only register, you can only do these projects or be part of this if you have some kind of quality, meet some kind of quality standards, no? So that's still not the accountability side, but at least it's kind of trying to say, look, not anything goes here. I mean, this is, I mean, I'm kind of really taken by the whole thing, no? And then you have sort of the accountability side. That's really hard, right? Because unless you can prove damage, I mean, and then the governments will have a totally, and causality. I mean, if you give money to something, I mean, the donor country, even if it's a public actor or a private actor, will be very difficult to prove causality here, or attribute direct responsibility for a project that was done in good faith to the person who gave, or the donor, or the foundation, or the country. No, so there's fragmentation, but there's also real legal issues involved that are very difficult to actually prove. No, and
Indeed,
like hard questions. So anyway, I really enjoyed your discussion, and I learned a lot from it, and I'm curious about what you had to say now.
yeah. Well, in terms of legal responsibility, because this was a part of my doctoral dissertation, so I'm happy to talk about it, and I agree. You know, we've had a lot of difficulty, even in the case of international financial institutions, where, you know, you have recognized international legal personality, where you have an institution on its own that, you know, will say, well, I don't go into political issues, but in terms of, you know, human rights, responsibility for human rights breaches, you know, we've had a very tough time, even with international financial institutions, where they go in directly to finance a project, but they do it through contractual schemes that make them sort of place them far away from actually what's happening on the ground, because they're not going to be the implementers of the project. And the project sponsors might have contractors that, you know, if it's building something, a power plant, whatever, the fact that their workers' rights issues might be the issue of the contractor, as opposed to the sponsor, as opposed to the international financial institution that supports it. Here, it's even, I think, more difficult in the case of some of these, because, so take a bond, a vaccine bond, or an development impact bond. Yes, of course, big institutional investors might invest in it, but they might also be banks. Take one of those big multinational banks. They decide that they're going to buy this bond. They make it a part of their portfolio, and then when you put your pension money, well, or you know, you start accumulating your pension there, or you have a little bit of a savings account there, as you know, you, me, all of us could end up, you know, Jessica and I could be ending up investors in that scheme without knowing, because we don't know what the bundle of our stocks or, you know, the securities and all this bundle that's going to be in our portfolio, that's going to be run by someone in the bank who's going to select from whatever the bank has invested in, depending on your risk profile. Yes, it's very hard, you know, and the power you have, of course, if you have a savings account in a bank, and if it's considerable enough, is to say, I don't want my money going into something that doesn't have any accountability, framework behind it. And I think that's why they've been offering some sustainable portfolios now more and more. These banks saying, well, it's not going to give you huge returns, but then if you look at the details of that sustainability portfolio, you might actually end up with a Rhino bond in your hands. And maybe the Rhino bond will work because, you know, it's a one-time intervention, and it might actually increase the rhino population by, what is it, 10%? So you have, you know, 10 rhinos, and if you have 11 rhinos, you're done in 5 years, essentially. I don't know the numbers, but I'm just making it up. But then you don't, I mean, so it's really hard to penetrate from a legal responsibility perspective. And you can maybe go after, so where I see the responsibility sort of links more directly is to the donor government, to the big financial intermediary. Those are the institutional or the multi-stakeholder partnership that's offering this. So it's really those institutions that are involved in the project, although it's going to be sort of a difficult link, it's the ones that offer the investment opportunity that we have a greater chance of influencing or, you know, pressuring into putting standards into these schemes. Because I think the individual investors, and you're right that there are not that many people still, depending on, you know, what they invest in, people might choose to invest in stocks in big sort of internet companies or going to space instead of you know, having more rhinos, black rhinos in South Africa. And that's true, but I think there's always government's money that's going in there, and for what purpose? And why not? Because the idea that I think that started this was that motto of from billions to trillions used by the World Bank. That the idea was basically we're going to take you know, $1 billion of, let's say, government funding that would have normally gone into as grants or as loans to developing countries. Instead, we're going to put it in this type of investment scheme, and it's going to generate much more money for us. And that is still, I think, up to debate. We are not seeing the promises being delivered in terms of the catalyzing, the leveraging, the crowding in of investments. I think it's still negligible for investors. It's still a niche area in a way. And I think you're right that there are all these problems, and the money, the government's, you know, the money that could be used now is being used to pilot these schemes. And so what is the opportunity cost for people on the ground or for the environment? That's a huge issue, but I think the legal responsibility, in terms of legal responsibility, I think the only chance we have is to connect with donor governments, the governments in you know, recipient countries to a lesser extent because they don't have that kind of leverage, but also to the institutional institutions that are intermediaries in all of this.
Thank you, Gamze. I was thinking when you were talking about so answering the question on the epistemology of all this, which obviously goes back to the unification, right? And how that is also problematic from the perspective of the European Green Deal, in terms of almost an alienation of the public in the debate, because the moment that we start talking about bonds and we start talking about loans and grants, it becomes a very technical, it's almost like a black box, right? That we kind of lose sight of the bigger picture. And if we look at what we need in terms of transition and in terms of like the very small space of time that we have to really tackle the climate emergency, then of course this raises question, because we have these immediate projects that look good, but then the bigger picture of what we are really doing to stop the collapse of the planet, really, it's the big question there. And I think from our perspective, when we talk about a just transition, is the idea of also questioning whether the concept of just transition, what does it mean within the European Green Deal, and what is it focusing on, and what are the other epistemologies around what a just transition is. So a lot of questions that also, of course, go back to a legal perspective of the public good and what rights we might want to foreground or are not getting foreground in the debate. Okay, so any other question? Yes, Arend Kilic, our colleague in the project. Please, Arend.
Hello, I hope you can hear me. Thank you very much, first of all, for this wonderful presentation. I have 3 different questions which are unrelated to each other, all 3. First of all, to follow up the previous question about the solutions, it's a very brief question. How do you see the endeavor of UN Global Compact that also you mentioned in your presentation? Because it's a gathering of private actors, and do you think, like, what is your assessment regarding the UN Global Compact? Do you see future actually in this, and do you assess, will you grade well their activity, their sustainability principles? Because they also actually indicate some other principles regarding sustainable finance. For instance, in Sustainable Ocean Principles, they give particular key point indicators even. So we see an endeavor, definitely. But I'm just wondering your assessment. Secondly, also it's a follow-up to Daria's question. We talk about legal accountability problems. For instance, in European Union, it might be even more difficult. And also, as actually emphasized by Anna Ford long ago, there's a question of democratic accountability. What do you think, in particular, European Green Deal? Because do you think? Yeah, my question is whether do you think in European Green Deal it's even difficult? The accountability question is even more difficult because of the organization of the Union. Or do you see strength? Because, for instance, when we look at the past, we regarding the green projects funded by European Investment Bank, we only see one case actually before the European Ombudsman, and it is it's related to a project in Georgia, even still funded by European Investment Bank, but still it's only before the European Ombudsman Bank. For instance, do you think European Court of Justice can even have a role in this context? And the last one is a bit, it's about the commodification of nature, because you presented this as a danger, but I would like to, I have been thinking also during our project, actually during our work, I have been thinking that in international human rights law, for instance, we recognize the collective property rights of indigenous people. Then when we recognize actually right to property, then it comes with the assumption of commodity actually. Then if it's like if the land is not commodity, then there cannot be right to property either. I think it's my idea. So what do you think about this? Do you really think it's that there's an inconsistency actually between the international human rights law and this new financial instruments? Or do you think there's a systematical problem even in our legal terminology, maybe, in recognizing right to collective property of indigenous people on land, on environment actually? Maybe you see it's a fundamental problem in international human rights, so I don't know. I was just wondering. These are my questions. Thank you, Anna.
Thank you so much, Ernst. And so I'll try to go through it. And the first issue of, I think, how do you see the UN Global Compact? Right? I think it, in a way, was at the time of its inception a sort of innovative idea of let's bring together all those companies that are performing well in terms of corporate social responsibility, all those like good business enterprises that are engaging in responsible conduct, and let's, those willing to agree on these 10 principles, and let's have a big event, and let's have branches in different countries, especially where you have a lot of multinationals, and let's try to bring them into into the development agenda, not just in terms of, and for lack of a better word, global north, global south type of development, but also within wealthy societies to address equity issues that are still very much out there. And I think 20 years ago, it was, for the UN, important to have that kind of backing as they were embarking into this new agenda, new millennium. So like everyone has a stake, everyone is involved. In terms of the performance, I think there's been a lot of concerns. I think Upendra Bakshi had written a letter saying this is blue washing, that corporations, and he's the guy that worked on the Bhopal disaster for many years to bring justice to the victims, and so he's saying, well, this is blue washing, blue as in the UN colors, and companies, notwithstanding their possibly horrible performance in human rights in environmental terms elsewhere, can sign on. There's no teeth. There's no really follow-up. Nothing that you actually have to do. So you don't have to report. There is no, if you don't do what you promise you will do, there's, besides maybe naming and shaming by NGOs and civil society, that is, and that's not the UN naming and shaming, there's not really much else that it can accomplish. This being said, I think if there is genuine involvement of corporations that don't mind having standards in place because they care about how they work, and in many cases this is not true, but then it would amount to something. It would, and of course there are corporations, even during the negotiations for the binding instrument, right? There are corporations that have come out to say that at the European level, associations of different industries that have come out to say we don't shy away from obligations and sort of standards of law, but they're a minority. So I think, yes, voluntary initiatives might be good, but I think if they end up replacing initiatives that have more grasp, more teeth, that really deliver to the rights holders, I think they can be detracting from the debates, or worse, really allowing corporations or other kinds of entities to wash their hands of their bad performance just by seemingly doing something at the international level that benefits people. So I think I'm skeptical. I think it needs a much more honest look to see whether it should be reformed, whether it should be kept or not. I'm not saying that we should not have these kinds of voluntary initiatives. I think sometimes they're useful. For instance, when there were a lot of rampant reports of the use of forced child labor and adult labor in Uzbekistan in the cotton fields, major retailers, and not the traders, but the retailers came together to say, under the cotton pledge, we're boycotting. We're not going to purchase Uzbek cotton knowingly anymore. And it actually puts pressure on the government. So it can work. But you have to be willing to talk and walk the walk. Otherwise, it's not going to amount to much. On the second point about legal accountability in the EU, I think structurally speaking, from on paper, there are more avenues for accountability. I think you've mentioned that sort of the major ones. You've mentioned the fact that you can go to the European Investment Bank complaints mechanism. You can go even to the European Court of Justice. You can go to the European Ombudsman if you think one of the institutions is infringing upon your rights, and possibly through its use of these mechanisms. In terms of democratic accountability, I am So I have a mitigated answer. I know that there's a lot of talk, there was at least a lot of talk about the democratic deficit in the EU, right? That many of the more important decisions were taken up at the council level, and it's to an extent still true. The European Parliament, though, has been gaining more and more voice, I think, with the advent of information communication technologies and the fact that you can voice your concerns to the world, essentially. That has given, I think, members of parliament a renewed sort of platform, a different platform, and maybe a little bit more leverage. And I think I think we shouldn't forget the possibility of coalition building in the EU. At the domestic level, in some countries would not be possible. So passing real green legislation may not be possible in countries where a majority of the parliament is not progressive enough to do it. But and you might end up having a very small green party, but when they have a coalition at the European level with other parties or other actors that are of the same mind, I think it matters. And I think there are, when the European Commission is coming out with proposals, I think a lot of civil society organizations, think tanks try to put in, give input. And I think the Commission, to an extent, listens. Of course, it's a matter of, leveraging and power politics in a sense, because in all political sort of governance schemes it is. But I think from a legal accountability perspective, there's more for the citizens to do about what goes on in Europe. Of course, it's a different ballgame for citizens in developing countries when the European Union is financing an ostensibly green mechanism that they don't think is green, or despite the fact that it generates maybe returns for a greener future, it does it so by infringing upon your rights, etc. So I think there's an opportunity for European citizens to question and to put these schemes to test. But I'm not sure, and I think a lot of civil society organizations have signed on to a declaration saying the European Green Deal should also work for developing countries. And I think that's a point of, accountability that perhaps is lacking more so than internally. And finally, the commodification of nature. By commodification, I mean more the marketization, the fact that you can sell it. You can sell sort of the procreation future of rhino, if you put it bluntly. So to me, the collective property rights of indigenous populations in a way codify the land that they own. They codify not all legal systems allow for this, but in the legal systems that do, it's to say, yes, that land belongs to that group, so it cannot be taken over. It cannot be sort of detached from them in legal ways or political ways, that they have an entitlement to be on that land. And I think it's a sort of it's a mechanism, yes, that attaches a capitalistic concept of property rights to something that isn't born out of that thinking, that way of thinking and ideationalization. But of course, we tend to work from a pragmatic perspective. I think the lawyers that represent indigenous populations, et cetera, that we tend to work in the system that we have. Although the system that we have might not respond to exactly what we need. So you're right in that we're using the language of commodities when we do that. But sometimes that's, I think, the only way to ensure that there's a claim on that land by that population. So I share the concerns, and I think here we have to sort of also give, echo whale scholars and those who've written on how capitalist accumulation happens through that kind of land titling, taking away people's land and titling it on behalf of someone else, and the populations having no say. So I think although it's a rectification measure that comes too late after the whole system has been put in place, I think it's just a practical way to resolve an issue without a legal overhaul of the system, which might never come. So there, I share your concerns about the semantics and what that means. But I'm also sometimes prone to being pragmatic in that, yes, we use the language that is the language for these people, maybe of the oppressor, to mitigate oppression. And that's a difficult case to make, but I think it's what it is.
Excellent, Gamze. Thanks very much. So I think unless there are any other burning questions from the floor, perhaps we should close it here. Just to echo something that you were saying about the use of the term commodity and commodification, I think one point that is very important is the fact of creation of a fictitious value, right? And also, as you said very clearly, the fact that this can, so not only that the land can be sold, but that the interest in the land can be then invested in and then resold as an investment. And so the fact that there is really an incorporation and an entrenched embedment in the market and what that means when it comes to protection of the environment. Anastasia has a question. I can see. Please.
It's a very short comment on.
That's okay. We still have 10 minutes.
But I'll try to be concise. So again, going back to the idea of commodification, I think that it might be useful to the pragmatism becomes a bit easier if we embrace legal pluralism in a certain way, and if we think that the idea of property rights that we have, we as a Western society in a way, is very much this linked to the Lockean idea that property and the right over land is the right to work the land. But it's not necessarily the only way to conceptualize the property rights, and property rights it is a bundle of rights. And I think that it doesn't necessarily have to mean this capitalistic inclination to it, and its recognition is not necessarily about to the idea that land is mine only if I work it, because basically that's what I think contributed to that's the idea behind the unequal treaties that proved so deleterious.
Thank you, Anastasia. Gamze, do you want to say something?
Well, thank you so much to everyone for sort of being here for those 2 hours, but also for really engaging questions and comments. And I love it when there's a rapport between what I'm saying and what the audience is essentially feeling. And I feel very strongly, as you might have seen, about these issues from a researcher perspective, but I find them fascinating, and not just in a very sort of boxed in way, but in all of their implications about about ideas, about systems, about governance. And I tend to be a bigger picture person, so I have to also sort of force myself to go into the nitty-gritty details, but then I was always trying to look back at the bigger picture, what that means. And I hope it's been useful, and I know that many of you do research in different fields. So I hope it was
It was fantastic, Gamze.
Yes,
thank you very much.
Sort of conveying my ideas to a broader audience in a way that wasn't too technical, I hope.
No, you certainly did, and I think it's really the thank you for sharing such a wealth of information and for really mapping clearly for us the various problems at the bigger level, because for us it's really important to understand the bigger picture in order for us to then pinpoint the main issues for the European Green Deal, which you also flagged to us. So thanks very much for joining us and for launching this seminar series. We have bombarded you with questions, but which you were great at answering. So thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for all the work that you've done in organizing this wonderful seminar.
Okay, so we'll close this here, and so this recording will be made available on the page of the project, which is on the faculty pages. Will be in the faculty pages soon, and also on the IEL Collective website and on the NetDef Network website. So I will be sharing the links with you all, hopefully as soon as possible. And for those of you who would like to receive the video, then you can get in touch with me through the email address that was on the advertisement. Thanks very much. Thank you, Gamze.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.